The Ashes of Abraham, a Century at War. Look at these two images. On the left, Tel Aviv, glass towers, neon lights, beachfront wealth, missile defense systems, and the illusion of normal life. On the right, Gaza City, collapsed concrete. Twisted rebar, entire neighborhoods erased, and children growing up under the sound of drones instead of birds. They are separated by just 70 kilometers, less than the distance of a morning commute in many cities. And yet, they exist in two different centuries. One side looks like the future, the other looks like the aftermath of the apocalypse. This is not just a war zone. This is the collision point of history. Empire, religion, nationalism, memory, trauma, occupation, resistance, revenge, and survival. It is April 2026. For much of the world, the push notifications have slowed. The headlines moved on. The algorithms found a new crisis. But for the roughly 14 million people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the war never ended. It simply became the air they breathe. Since the explosion of violence in October 2023, the numbers have become almost too large for the human mind to hold. Tens of thousands dead. Entire bloodlines erased. Cities shattered. Hostages taken. Families buried under rubble. Children turned into statistics. In a land smaller than New Jersey, every square kilometer is soaked in a history that refuses to stay buried. So how did we get here? Is this really an ancient religious blood feud stretching back to Abraham? Or is it something even more dangerous? A very modern political tragedy built by empires, borders, fear, and failed leadership? Today, we are not just telling the story of a war. We are entering the furnace of one of the most devastating and unresolved conflicts in modern history. This is the Ashes of Abraham, a century at war. Let's dive deep for minutes. Crash of Two Nationalisms. To understand this conflict, you have to strip away the slogans. This is not simply Muslims versus Jews. It is not just terrorism versus self-defense, and it is not only a dispute over land. At its core, this is the collision of two national movements, both born from trauma. Both convinced history has left them no alternative. Both believing survival requires sovereignty over the same land. And when two peoples believe the same territory is essential to their existence, compromise becomes more than political. It becomes existential. The Ottoman Twilight. Travel back to the late 1800s. What we now call Israel and Palestine was then part of the Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic imperial system that had ruled the region for centuries. Palestine was not an empty desert waiting for destiny. It was a lived-in land. Arab, Muslim, and Christian communities farmed it, traded in it, worshipped in it, buried their dead in it, and passed stories through generations in it. For the Arab population, this was not an abstract claim. It was home. But far away in Europe, another story was unfolding. Across Russia, Eastern Europe, and beyond, Jews faced pogroms, expulsions, discrimination, humiliation, and violence. For centuries, Jewish communities had survived as minorities in states that could turn on them overnight. And from that trauma emerged a revolutionary idea: Zionism. The argument was simple and terrifying. If every other people can claim a nation, and if Jews remain scattered and vulnerable, then safety is an illusion unless Jews have a state of their own. To many Jews, Zionism was not colonial ambition. It was a survival doctrine. To many Arabs, it would soon look like something else entirely. 3. The British time bomb. Then came World War I. The Ottoman Empire began to collapse. And into that vacuum stepped the British Empire, with its usual imperial specialty, making promises it had no intention of reconciling. To Arab leaders, Britain signaled support for independence if they revolted against Ottoman rule. To Zionist leaders, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, supporting the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. One land, two peoples, two promises, one empire. It was a diplomatic time bomb with a delayed fuse. Under British rule, Jewish immigration increased. Land purchases expanded. Arab fears deepened. What one side saw as refuge, the other saw as displacement. What one side called return, the other called encroachment. And by the 1930s and 1940s, the ground was already cracking. Independence versus catastrophe. Then came the moment that still defines everything. After the Holocaust, the industrialized murder of 6 million Jews in Europe, international support for a Jewish state intensified. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning the land into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. The Zionist leadership accepted the plan, not because it gave them everything they wanted, but because it gave them a state. Arab leaders rejected it, seeing it as a colonial division imposed against the will of the Arab, majority already living there. Then the war came. For Jews, 1948 is the year of independence, the birth of Israel, a miracle after centuries of statelessness and persecution. For Palestinians, 1948 is the Nakba, the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced or fled from their towns and villages. Some ran from battle. Some were expelled. Some left expecting to return in days or weeks. Many never did. They locked their doors. They carried deeds. They took iron keys. Those keys became symbols, not just of lost homes, but of a people frozen in historical suspension. Today, millions of Palestinians remain refugees or descendants of refugees, many still holding memory like inheritance. And from that moment forward, both peoples built their identity around the same date, but with opposite meanings. For one, liberation, for the other, dispossession. That is the original fracture. 1967, the Six-Day Shift. If 1948 created the conflict's emotional core, 1967 transformed its political reality. In just 6 days, Israel defeated surrounding Arab armies and captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights. For many Israelis and Jews around the world, it felt like a stunning act of survival. The memory of annihilation was still fresh. And now, suddenly, Jews stood at the Western Wall again. Biblical geography became military reality. But military victory carried a long shadow, because after 1967, Israel was no longer just defending borders. It was ruling over millions of Palestinians who did not consent to Israeli sovereignty, and that is where the conflict changed form. It became not just a war between states, but a system of occupation, checkpoints, military permits, land seizures, administrative detention, house demolitions, walls, settler roads, control without citizenship. And with occupation came the next irreversible force: settlements. Jewish communities built inside occupied Palestinian territory. To many Israelis, especially religious nationalists, these were historic and sacred returns to ancestral land. To Palestinians, and to most of the international community, they were illegal colonization. Each new settlement did not just change the map, it changed the future. Because every hilltop outpost became another obstacle to a viable Palestinian state, and over time, the map of the West Bank began to look less like a country in waiting, and more like a shattered mirror. The First Intifada, Oslo, and the Mirage of Peace. By the late 1980s, Palestinians rose up in what became known as the First Intifada. This was not initially a war of missiles. It was a popular uprising. Stones against rifles, strikes against occupation, mass anger against permanent control. The images shocked the world. Eventually, that pressure helped create the illusion, and for a brief moment, the possibility of peace. In the 1990s, the world watched the Oslo Accords. Historic handshakes, smiles on the White House lawn, the language of mutual recognition. Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized each other. The dream was simple: a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Land for peace, two peoples, two flags, one future. For one brief moment, the wheel looked like it might stop, but peace was assassinated from both sides. An Israeli extremist murdered, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the man most associated with Oslo. On the Palestinian side, Hamas escalated suicide bombings, convincing many Israelis that concessions brought terror, not peace. Trust did not merely weaken, it evaporated. And in this conflict, once trust disappears, every dead child becomes an argument for the next escalation. Gaza, the pressure cooker. Then came Gaza, a tiny coastal strip densely packed, politically explosive, and psychologically central to the modern conflict. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlements and permanent military presence from Gaza. Some believed this could open a new path. Instead, the internal Palestinian system fractured. In 2006, Hamas won elections. In 2007, after violent internal conflict, Hamas took control of Gaza. The Palestinian national movement split in two: the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, Gaza under Hamas. Israel, with Egypt controlling its own border-crossing dynamics, responded with a severe blockade. Gaza became one of the most enclosed and heavily controlled territories on Earth. For Israel, the logic was security. For Palestinians, the reality was suffocation, restricted movement, economic strangulation, periodic wars, infrastructure collapse, unemployment, dependency, trauma layered over trauma. And inside that pressure cooker, militancy hardened. Meanwhile, Israel built one of the most sophisticated missile defense systems in the world. Iron Dome, a technological shield against rockets. But technology can intercept missiles. It cannot intercept history. October 7th, the tectonic break. Then came October 7th, 2023, a date that shattered whatever remained of the old status quo. Hamas launched a massive surprise attack from Gaza into southern Israel. Communities were overrun. Civilians were massacred. People were abducted. Families were burned, shot, and terrorized. For Israel, it was not just an attack. It was a civilizational trauma. The deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. And after that day, Israeli politics crossed a threshold. The old debates about containment, deterrence, and periodic escalation collapsed. What followed was Israel's massive military retaliation in Gaza, framed as a war to destroy Hamas once and for all. But in practice, the scale of destruction became staggering. Entire districts flattened, hospitals overwhelmed or destroyed, schools turned to shelters, then rubble, aid blocked or delayed, disease spread, famine warnings escalated, civilian life collapsed. The world watched in horror. Some called it self-defense. Some called it collective punishment. Some called it genocide. Some called it a war crime layered on top of a war crime. But regardless of the language, the images were undeniable. A modern city turned into a graveyard. And the longer the war continued, the more one terrifying truth emerged. There may be no military solution to a political catastrophe this deep. The world in 2026, the new reality. So where are we now? It is April 2026, and the phrase two-state solution still echoes in UN speeches, summit communique, and diplomatic panels. But on the ground, it sounds like a ghost story. In Israel, the political center has eroded. One camp openly pushes for permanent military control, annexation of the West Bank, expanded settlements, and in some cases, the removal or permanent subjugation of Palestinians. Another camp warns, you cannot call yourself a democracy while ruling indefinitely over millions of people who lack equal political rights. In Palestine, a generation has now grown up with almost no living memory of a real peace process. They did not grow up with Oslo. They did not grow up with handshakes. They grew up with drones, walls, raids, funerals, rubble, checkpoints, seek, humiliation, and the feeling that international law is something spoken about, but never enforced. For them, diplomacy often sounds like theater. And when people stop believing justice can arrive through politics, they become vulnerable to those who promise it through force. That is how endless war reproduces itself. This is not just a religious war. Many outsiders still misunderstand this conflict. They reduce it to Jews versus Muslims, ancient hatred, biblical revenge, tribes that can never live together. That is lazy analysis. Yes, religion matters. Jerusalem matters. Sacred sites matter. Biblical memory matters. But this is not fundamentally a war because Abraham had two sons. This is a modern conflict shaped by European anti-Semitism, colonial partition, statelessness, occupation, settler expansion, failed diplomacy, regional wars, militarized identity, collective trauma, and leadership that repeatedly weaponized fear. This is not an inevitable curse. It is a man-made catastrophe. And what is made by humans can, in theory, be unmade by humans, but only if the myths are stripped away first. The tragedy of dual rights. Here is the hardest truth, and maybe the most important one. This land contains two peoples with real claims. The Jews are not leaving. After centuries of exile, persecution, expulsions, pogroms, and genocide, the Jewish need for security is not propaganda. It is historical reality. And the Palestinians are not disappearing. They are not a demographic inconvenience. They are not an obstacle to someone else's prophecy. They are a people with roots, memory, land, language, identity, and the undeniable right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination. This is the tragedy. Two valid rights have been forced into a political structure, where only one is, allowed to breathe at a time. And every time one side tries to solve that contradiction by domination, the future becomes more violent. Occupation cannot produce peace. Terror cannot produce liberation. Bombing children cannot create security. Massacring civilians cannot create justice. Walls can delay danger. Missiles can punish enemies. Armies can destroy buildings. But none of them can solve the core equation. An Israeli child's safety is inseparable from a Palestinian child's freedom. That is not poetry. That is the mathematics of peace. For over a century, this land has been trapped in a cycle. Trauma becomes fear. Fear becomes militarization. Militarization becomes domination. Domination becomes resistance. Resistance becomes retaliation. Retaliation becomes new trauma. And the wheel turns again. The names of the operations change. The weapons get smarter. The surveillance gets tighter. The justifications get louder. But the grief? The grief remains exactly the same. We no longer need another shouting match over who can narrate the past more loudly. The past matters. It matters deeply. But if history becomes only a weapon, then every grave becomes an argument for the next grave. The real question is no longer, who started it? The real question is, who is brave enough to stop it? Who is brave enough to tell Israelis that security without justice is an illusion? Who is brave enough to tell Palestinians that liberation built on the slaughter of civilians is a dead end? Who is brave enough to tell the world that peace is not a slogan, not a summit, not a photo op, but the dismantling of a system where one people's freedom depends on another, people's permanent fear? Until that happens, the towers will rise in one city, the rubble will deepen in another, and the children on both sides will inherit ashes instead of a future. This is not just the story of Israel and Palestine. This is the story of what happens when history is left untreated. Empire is never fully buried, and human beings are taught that the suffering of the other is the price of their own survival. And that is why this war has lasted so long. Not because peace is impossible, but because too many powerful people have found ways to live without it. The question is not whether this conflict can continue. It can. It has. For more than a century. The question is whether humanity will keep watching until there is nothing left to save.